Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar titled The Disinformation Landscape Across Europe. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. We are going to have a Q&A session using Slido, and you can either scan the code that you see on the screen or use the code disinfolab. This session is going to be recorded and it will be available for replays in a few days on our YouTube channel. Just to get started, I would kindly ask the participants to complete the first questions on Slido, which are going to be, where are you joining us from today? And secondly, to let us know which sector you represent. But without further ado, I'm really happy that we are hosting this webinar today about this amazing project, which could really count on a community-based response. Thank you for everyone who participated in writing or reviewing this country disinformation fact sheets, and for those who have read them and will read them soon. For those of you who do not know us, we are the EU DisinfoLab. We are an independent NGO focused on researching and tackling disinformation campaigns targeting the EU, its member states, and core values. And we also advocate for improvements in the field. A little bit of self-promotion. Make sure to subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter to be notified about similar events. And now, since this project would not be happening without the support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, I would like to have somebody from FNF, Jana Weber, to say a few words before we start. Jana, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also a warm welcome from us here at FNF in Brussels. My name is Jana Sproul. I got married since we last time talked. There was a little switch in there. And I'm in charge of everything human rights and disinformation related in the European region for us. A little bit briefly about FNF. We are very engaged in the global fight for human rights, against disinformation, to promote resilient democracies everywhere, in our offices abroad as well. And one thing we have seen time and time again when it comes to fighting disinformation in different regions is really that role that information plays, information being the key, access to and use of and misuse of as well, unfortunately, which is kind of where we're going here when it comes to disinformation. And it's very easy to vilify or to focus on external actors, we very much also originally. I think somebody has me unmuted. Even originally for us, we were talking a lot about external actors, about external influence, about Russia and China, for example, when we're talking about European disinformation. But now, especially in recent years, and having worked more on issues also of access to information, we delve more into what it means to have state-sponsored and national disinformation and what important role that plays, which we'll surely also get a bit into as part of this project down the road, and which we unfortunately have seen in elections recently in Hungary last year, where the lack of access to independent media and information has created a sphere which helped populism grow and which very much helped shape the outcome of the election in the favor of Viktor Orban. Overall, we're really happy to be engaged with disinfolab and their activities, and having been working with them for a couple of years now. In the past, we've been looking a lot into capacity building and the state of disinformation fighting actors across the EU and what their needs are. But with this project now, with all the country fact sheets and with the assessments looking at actors and factors across the EU, when it comes to disinformation, I think we're laying a really great groundwork when it comes to preparing for the EU elections that are now less than a year away from us, and that hopefully will not only help disinfolab or FNF in their work, but also so many other organizations in the network out there. So thank you very much once again for this really great cooperation. I'll hand over back to Maria Giovanna.
Thank you so much, Jana, and congratulations. Getting to know our amazing experts and speakers for today's webinar, we have with us Hanna Linderstål. She is the CEO and founder of cyber intelligence agency Earhart Business Protection Agency, with over 25 years of experience in combating digital and visual threats. And then we're going to hear from Eileen Culloty, who is assistant professor in the School of Communications and deputy director of the Institutes for Media, Democracy and Society, and she coordinates the European Digital Media Observatory on the front of the Irish Hub. And last but not least, Dr. Keith Peter Kiely, who is an experienced researcher at the Gate Institute with over 9 years of experiences in analyzing data and doing research in the field of misinformation, propaganda, inside and outside of academia. So far, we have had the great pleasure of collecting 14 country-specific fact sheets, looking at the disinformation landscape in all these different European realities. If we can have the slides showing the map and recalling the number of fact sheets. So these are the ones that that you see, and we hope to collect many more and to have the whole of the EU represented, and maybe even beyond that. I've had the pleasure of coordinating this project, which also means that I got to read all of the fact sheets, and of course many similarities emerge, as one would expect, especially regarding contextual factors such as COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, while other sort of background narratives that are known to the whole of the European public, yet tailored upon the different realities and countries where they are set, are, for instance, fears about economic failure and political polarization. But one narrative in particular that is really striking and we found particularly interesting because it is both a sort of evergreen, is migration. And for instance, coming from Italy, I can say that it's a deeply polarizing and salient issue, yet we notice how this is continuously evolving and adapting to both the country where it is spread and the circumstances. So I would like to leave the floor to Hanna and to ask her, so in the Swedish fact sheet, for instance, you focused on a conspiracy about authorities taking Muslim children away from migrant parents and converting them by force. We noticed that the same narrative appeared, for instance, in other Scandinavian or Baltic countries. So I would like to ask you, could you tell us a little bit more about this issue and the implications, please?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, EU DisinfoLab, for the invitation. Well, the Swedish information landscape has seen practically the same disinformation issue as the rest of Europe the last couple of years. It's been related, to COVID-19, vaccines, 5G radiation, renewable energy, and so forth. This underlines the already widely drawn conclusion that these issues are driven by multinational disinformation agents targeting at least Europe as a continent, not even, or if not even a broader audience. This information, or also called foreign information manipulation and interference, is a growing political and security challenge for the European Union and a fast-emerging threat towards democracy. Many of the mentioned themes for disinformation can be traced to broader narrative and linked to pro-Russian interests and actors, aiming to disturbing the democratic dialogue in society and promoting discord and distrust. The pro-Russian narrative and its actors have turned towards promoting the idea of peace and negation regarding the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Again, this follows the lies we see in the rest of Europe. Our report wanted to highlight a specific case for the Swedish context, the claim that Swedish social services kidnap children from migrant Muslim families to force them to become Christians, based on misunderstanding of the Swedish law, the dependence and confusion of the families that has been distorted by and amplified by both domestic and foreign actors, mainly in Arabic, the foreign actors. The narrative has increased the tension between the Swedish institutions and the community and the country's Muslim inhabitants. It has even migrated into a Russian information landscape today. It's interesting to notice, for example, when we saw the media outlet Vremya had a report about a Russian family that claimed they had to flee Sweden in order to avoid having their children taken away from them because they were speaking Russian in the school. It's obviously a lie because you're allowed to speak whatever language you like to in school, but maybe not in the lecture, I don't know. The migration of this narrative been between the context is an indication that target audience inside and outside Sweden respond as expected, and it gains strong attention among the target audience. So thus this one case of social media campaign based on, in the beginning, misunderstanding has developed to disinformation and information operation affecting trust in domestic institutions and in Sweden as a country, and even potentially in international relations. In the view of Sweden as a liberal country has been damaged, especially in the Muslim world. So one conclusion we can make is that the method of disinformation is evolving from the 2015-16 fake news era with the multiple fake news published to a more active strategy where social media posts, groups, and even news are picked up by accounts or groups with many followers, twisted to a narrative that often aim polarization and distrust towards government and society institutions, with engaging video clips, images, interviews, and it creates a movement by itself. It's a mix of people that comment and share because they're worried, with mix from posts and from accounts that infuse a flame like gasoline on a fire. And this is actually not so strange because we have an attention economy, and our attention economy feeds on the spread of disinformation. And that's right. We love when people like our posts. We even manipulate pictures and content to get the attention that we crave. Even the platforms are chosen by how much attention I get. So disinformation that get attention flies over social media by attention fuel alone, and with some extra missiles by actors increasing with hate and angry in the debate. So social media has become a tool of weapons, a tool and a weapon system in gaining power, polarize communities, and create distrust. And this is just what we see today. So, I mean, if you just open our eyes a bit and looking about tomorrow, which actually is this week, many AI tools are consistently built to provide an illusion of talking with someone who's thinking, considering being remorseful. We believe that disinformation is taking the AI step right now, and it's going really quickly. The AI designs is actually have the possibility to create disinformation adjusted to me, deploying deepfake for mimicking people, improving dubbing for video clips, writing email responses or chat responses, and the deepfake arena where we actually call them sheep fakes because it goes so fast, it's cheap, it's available for everybody. So today we witness a tremendous destruction created by an explosion of social anger aggravated by sophisticated social media algorithm and depolarization in society, and at the same time the opportunity to use a lot of more new tools. In our conclusion, we identify that disinformation or foreign information manipulation and interference is evolving and adapting, using new technologies, using the experience, using the public's interest, and it's been picked up by influencers and has the power to create chaos and be a real threat towards democracy. And that I think we all agree on. This is something we need to take very, very seriously.
Thank you, Hanna. Thank you. That was absolutely timely and very interesting indeed. We say this chaotic combination of matters that really does contribute to what we call the information disorder. So we have recurrent narratives that are continuously revived by different actors, and as you really well reminded us, and I really hope that we get to deep this a little bit after, we have a complete change and advancement in the tools that are used to deliver these messages, which are nonetheless spoken by some recurrent actors, and that also resonate well with the unhappiness and the social malaise of the population. So on this note, let's move to the Irish disinformation landscape, which is also polluted by many anti-refugee narratives. Eileen, in your fact sheet, you use the expression fake UGs, which is a combination of fake refugees. So how these people are unfortunately addressed by some disinformation narratives. And you also mentioned really well this overlap of content, because we have this anti-migratory narrative, which can range from Islamophobia to xenophobia, which also really plays into the narrative sentiments, that the nativist sentiments, sorry, that speak to a part of the population that is probably angry, as Anna told us. And so I'm wondering, can you please maybe paint us a picture of what is at stake and how these related narratives are weaponized by some malign actors?
Sure, and the Irish fact sheet was based on a report we did as part of the EDMO Ireland Hub, where we were just trying to give a high-level view of what's happening in Ireland and how it relates to the wider media landscape. Because I think it's interesting, well, to us it's interesting anyway, to think about, you know, how Ireland and what we're seeing here is similar in difference to what you find in other European countries. Because in many ways, that anti-migrant, anti-refugee rhetoric, we're all familiar with it, because it's a very old story, and you find it not just in Europe, you find it beyond Europe as well. It's that simple us versus them scapegoating. So you get the claims that migrants get special benefits that disadvantage Irish citizens, that they're linked to crime, that migrant men are a threat to white women and girls and so on, and that there's this big global conspiracy that allows this to happen, and that the mainstream media are either covering it up or just choosing to ignore it for their own reasons. And that narrative is just being played out everywhere. What I think is particular in Ireland is that we have some interesting maybe dimensions to it that creates a particular context for how we respond. And the first is a kind of a historical or political dimension, whereby, unlike many other European countries, we don't have a history of a radical right wing. Our history is very much of kind of centrist parties. And historically, we were the migrants. We were going out to other countries. We were not receiving them in. And one of the challenges there is that there's a lack of experience, I think, about how to deal with these types of actors, how to even talk about them, how to understand, might they become influential, because we just don't have the history. And even you can see the media here kind of struggling to know, should they be covering them? How should they be covering them? So that's one of the first challenges we have that maybe isn't as common in other countries. And then a second huge aspect is that we're a very small English-speaking country in the middle of a massive English-speaking market. So we've got the British on one side and the US on the other, and both of these have just a huge influence here, like culturally, historically, maybe even psychologically. So it's very difficult when you're a small country swamped by massive countries that dominate the global market in many ways. And in terms of disinformation, what it means is that there is a huge reactionary right wing in both of those countries that is very anti-migrant and anti lots of other things. And then those smaller groups in Ireland are immediately plugged into those. So when something happens in the US, like earlier this year, there was protests against library books that were being, they said these library books were promoting pedophilia. Almost immediately, that same thing started happening in Irish libraries. And the library system was taken completely by surprise because they've never seen this before. So that pace of influence is very new, and I think maybe more pronounced here than it might be in others. And then the third huge thing is just that Ireland itself as a country has changed massively in recent decades. Our population is growing, migration is a big part of that. I think Polish is now the second most common spoken language. So we have a whole new generation of what we call new Irish with new identities. And again, we just don't have the history maybe, or the language, or there's a lot of figuring out to happen. So when you then have this very vocal minority spouting all of these hateful rhetoric and disinformation about migration, I think it becomes very difficult with even people just being afraid of using the wrong word. And then, of course, there's just the other stuff that isn't common with other countries where, our media landscape is great flux, and there are these broader social inequalities, in particular issues like housing and accommodation. So there's this ripe environment for people to exploit grievances. And I think what all of that comes back to is that disinformation is just a symptom of other problems, and we can't just keep focusing on disinformation as the problem. We must understand it as the symptom of bigger dynamics.
Thank you, Eileen. This is indeed very well said. And I personally, when I heard you speak, I thought that this goes really well also with what is happening, for instance, in Italy. And I'm sure that so many of our people in the audience today felt the same about their own country. So how these malaise and social issues are so common throughout the EU, and but also how specific they are to a country that is rapidly changing and that is experiencing also, as you say, a change in perspective from being the one with the people migrating to being the one that is being a receiver country. And of course, all of these institutional distrust, I can only think about the massively negative effect that it can have on the European Union, which is another, of course, which is the common element of all these countries which we are discussing here today and in the fact sheets. So I think that the last but not least contribution that we'll hear today to start out this roundtable, Keith, I found that the Bulgarian disinformation landscape is really fascinating for its complexity. And in your fact sheet, you really reflect on the overlapping of the anti-migration sentiments with the anti-war sentiments, and also how these indeed fuel massive anti-EU sentiment. So can you please navigate us through the information disorder system there, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, we can take a bit from what Eileen and Hanna have just said and talk about the general kind of similarities in terms of the big meta-narratives, and those stem from that large-scale level of distrust towards social and political institutions, not just on the national level but on the international level. Of course, we have quite a lot of social and economic anger. Going to what Eileen has been saying as well, which kind of we should be careful to remember that precedes the current crisis of disinformation, that type of disillusionment with established political institutions is something which has preceded that and which is not new. It is being used now as a catalyst for disinformation campaigns to try and mobilize support. And consciously so. So it is fair, I think, to say that, especially in the Bulgarian context, that disinformation is quite a powerful and potent weapon used within the society, political weapon. Internally, there has been, quite a lot of instability with a large amount of general elections over the last 2 years, and an inability of any particular party to form a stable ruling government. We've had coalitions here in Bulgaria for 2 years, rotating coalitions, and I think Eileen really hit the point at base. If we want to strip it down, what are we looking at in Bulgaria in terms of the landscape? What we're essentially looking at is a conflict over the Bulgarian identity. What is Bulgarian identity going to be moving forward? Is there, similar to Ireland, is there that, and I'm sure Sweden as well, is there that traditional, historical, cultural link to, in Bulgaria's case, Russia, historically with the liberation from the Ottoman Empire, historically with the legacy of communism in the country, or is Bulgarian identity going to move more towards pro-EU, pro-NATO, more modern, what we call developed European country? Is that, and that is the general discussion in various degrees within the disinformation narrative. That's the general fight. That's the general, piece of meat that both sides are kind of scrapping over. And so you do see in the narratives around migrants, for example, obviously reflecting that stance of support of Ukrainian refugees. It's obviously seen as equivocal with support of the EU NATO position. A more neutral or a stance against them is obviously a more pro-Russia, pro-Russian sentiment. And both of those are not only prevalent on online platforms, but unlike other countries, they can be used in mainstream political discourse. So you get this discussion obviously manifesting itself in the national parliament, and oftentimes you see disinformation narratives seeping in there to the national parliament, because it's politically useful for one side or for another side to use it essentially to mobilize support. Bulgaria traditionally has been quite anti-migration during the Middle Eastern refugee crisis. And of course, with the onset of the Ukraine war, there was quite an initial, like everywhere, support towards Ukraine during, like publicly at least, the loudest voices were quite supportive, vocally supportive of Ukraine's position. And initially, when Ukrainian refugees start coming to Ireland, to Bulgaria, you get this kind of high level of support. But very quickly afterwards, you get the economic resentment, you get the discussions over whether or not these are real refugees because they're driving really fancy cars, because they've got lots of money with them. You get discussions historically about renaming particular areas here in Bulgaria after Ukrainian places, and these dialogues or these narratives around disrespect, that the refugees do not respect, what the people are doing for them, that they're economically dishonest, that they're taking advantage, all the familiar tropes, but tied in some way at base to this idea that the Ukraine crisis or the Ukraine war is not a real war where real people are suffering, if you get what I mean, on the disinformation narrative side of things, where people are fleeing because it's economically opportunistic to flee, or because it's part of the EU's dilution policies or approach, or the US's aims to keep control over Bulgaria for strategic geopolitical reasons, or whatever that is. So that is the playing field. And on the other side, there's quite a strong reaction against that in terms of pro-US groups here and US funded groups here, USAID and US for Bulgaria, and those types of groups who are trying to counteract disinformation from their perspective, but who come to the problem with a particular ideological bent. And this serves as a cyclical kind of mechanism where people see that data and they immediately discount it as being biased because it's coming from a US funded entity or something like this. So it's quite, it may be perpetuating some kinds of discussion, but those are the dynamics. It's as everybody has kind of already touched on, I think it's really important to remember that these narratives are exploiting existing fissures within society, existing local contextualized fissures, that they are not creating them by themselves, but that they are exacerbating them through these particular methods. And if we really want to tackle these issues, if we really want to tackle the issue of disinformation effectively, we have to look at the root causes, whether those are economic, whether those are social, or whatever they are, cultural. We have to look at those, because this particular appeal to nativist sentiment that we see has been going on now for a long time. It's not a new phenomenon, and that is really what has facilitated this particular this new environment, in my view.
Thank you, Keith. Indeed, this is so true that, as also Eileen, but also Hanna said, disinformation is just a symptom to a more rooted cause. And I have really come to the understanding more and more that disinformation right now really prides upon the threat of our lifestyle, our daily lifestyle being threatened or permanently altered by what is happening in the world, whether it is a pandemic, a war, and the following economic consequences. So I hope you enjoyed this very interesting first round of contribution by our speakers, and I am very glad to open the Q&A. I remind you that questions can be asked on slido.com using the QR code that you see on screen or the hashtag disinfolab. And we already have one question I see, which I think is very, very coherent with our conversation. And I will pose it generally to the speakers, and whoever wants takes the floor and to contribute to it. And the question is, what do you expect to be the main common challenges in terms of mis and disinformation facing the European countries in the run-up to the 2024 elections? So, who wants to start? Hanna, yes, please.
Better remove my hand directly. Okay, I just think we have had a taste on how difficult 2024 can be. I believe we're going to see more and more artificial intelligence making interaction with disinformation in a larger scale. And that's quite worrisome. I'm a bit worried that every country, every institution is doing their own work regarding disinformation and sometimes don't understand or discuss with each other when something pops up. So I believe we're going to see a challenge in different layers, and we have to adjust now because the real world and the digital world are increasingly mingled by intelligent digital techniques, and more people are living through social media and their own information bubble. And it's also not only the algorithm that is tailored for the personal profile and situation, it's also all the possibilities with all the tools. And I actually want to say, I don't think disinformation is just something that's happening. It's actually a tool in the toolbox. It's a weapon in the weapon system to change your political view, to influence you to think or trust something. And I believe that we're going to see a new level during 2024.
I think just
please, Eileen, go ahead.
Following up on that, it's quite difficult to think about, or it can be quite difficult to think on common challenges when you're talking about something like European elections, because of course the dynamics within countries varies quite a lot. Here in Ireland, for example, European elections are often odd in a way because the Irish population in general is hugely positive towards Europe. I think in some recent Eurobarometer, we've one of the highest positive approval ratings for the EU, but we tend to elect people to the European Parliament who are very anti-EU and quite contrary for lots of other reasons. And that's going to be the most common thing here because some of our current MEPs have very frequently been accused of spreading disinformation, and particularly pro-Russia disinformation. So that's going to be a big dynamic here, I would imagine. And one of the other challenges that I think has always befallen European elections is that many of us in our countries and our media don't think in a collective European perspective. So we're having our own national conversations instead of contributing to this bigger European conversation. So the underlying issue is still that we need to have more collaborative structures to address these things.
And yeah, I would just say, you know, the biggest challenge, as Eileen just also said as well, it's not easy to come up with, you know, the main common challenges because of the different variations in each market. I mean, there are some broad general themes that we see across those markets, but in terms of how they're going to be, you know, how difficult they're going to be, it's difficult to say. But I do think that kind of the main thing is the reactive nature of how we're responding to disinformation now. I mean, disinformation is not going away with the advent of AI, as Maria was saying, and that being introduced into the sphere. It's going to only get worse. So I think the biggest challenge is, you know, creating the political will do something about the root causes of disinformation. My biggest concern at the present is that disinformation is being increasingly discussed in more and more narrow terms, where it seems to be relegated to only a discussion of the external actors and how the external actors are affecting discourses within particular markets. That, of course, is a really important issue, and that should be looked at really, really closely and combated in every way possible. But there is more to this issue. And we do a disservice to it, and we don't do much in terms of solving it if we ignore those aspects of it too.
Thank you. The next question is that got many votes. What do you think is the best regulatory framework for combating disinformation in your jurisdiction or in general? And again, Hanna. So we keep this.
Yeah, but this is so important. Well, you can't regulate disinformation. You can't have a law about the truths and lies and what is right and what is wrong. It doesn't suit the democratic room. So I don't think you can regulate it. I think the only method or the only thing we can do is increase knowledge about disinformation, increase trust in institutions, inform people that this is a method to keep on getting your views of the society disrupted. So I don't believe you can regulate disinformation, but though you can put pressure on the platforms, because the algorithms has a lot of responsibility in this. Because if I click on something, for example, I believe that airplanes are spraying gas over the world. If I click on that, I'm going to get more information about that. It doesn't matter what platform I'm on. I know several platforms are pretty good on removing or noting fake news, but I believe that's a very dangerous road to go. So I don't think you can regulate it. I think you increase knowledge and increase public knowledge about disinformation, about the system, and put pressure on the platforms about the algorithms.
I agree with what Anna says about you can't regulate disinformation, but you can regulate particular sectors. So the obvious one are tech companies, and to link it to the other question that's there about making attributing complex influence operations, well, tech companies could help a lot there, and that would be more helpful if they were regulated. But also if you think about the media sector itself, how is that regulated or not regulated, and what are the consequences of that? If you think about the current European Media Freedom Act and whether the provisions in that are there in the interests of media and democracy, or some provisions there in the interests of the French publishing industry or the publishing industry in Germany or wherever it is. So those aren't disinformation specific issues. Those are the issues around it that mean we have maybe a better informed citizenry or a more resilient population or ecosystem around it. And I think attention needs to go there. And then to those bigger things about addressing social inequalities that make these disinformation narratives less appealing in the first place. But it's a nonsense to think that we somehow, there's a solution to disinformation. We're kind of sucked into this rhetoric of tech companies that there's a solution for everything. There isn't. There has always been disinformation, and there have always been gray areas. And because we're in democracies, people are allowed to hold views that we don't like, and they're perfectly entitled to them. And we have to be just very careful about assuming that that's a problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better than that. I would just add that perhaps one thing we also need to keep in mind when we talk about regulatory frameworks and methods of combating disinformation, that there is also a need for us to look as a society at how we consume media and how we take in information, and to examine that, and to maybe look at how we can adapt our modern media literacy initiatives, or even general education initiatives, to kind of sync with the new digital environment, because we need to catch up. As societies across Europe, we have kind of moved on leaps and bounds technologically over the last few decades, but our education systems need to catch up with that. And we need to create a sense of individual responsibility for media consumption in a similar way that we do for food consumption or for any other type of consumption as human beings. And that's probably the best, in my view, way to effectively manage the problem. As you say, I really don't believe either that you can regulate the problem, but you can regulate the actions of these platforms who refuse to cooperate with specific initiatives, or who only cooperate to a certain point, let's say. I mean, that monetization of disinformation should be something which is quite strictly monitored, yeah, in my view.
Yes. Thank you. Next question. How do you see the difference between domestic and foreign information operations in the detection and tackling points of view? Who wants to take this? Yes, Anna.
Well, that's a tough question. If I got it right, you can't. It depends. It depends on the platform. It depends on what you're looking at. I mean, there's no flag that says this is a domestic information operation, or this is an interest group that's doing this, or this is a single person starting a new movement, or this is a foreign state trying to create chaos in the country. There's not such a flag. And depending on the platform, if you look, for example, at disinformation on TikTok, it's impossible to see the source. You don't have any information. You can't follow any image data or anything by an old school OSINT work that you did on social media like a couple of years ago. So that's not easy. The easiest thing to do when you want to see if this is something in a larger scale, it's comparing different countries and see, is this phenomenon joining in other countries at the same time? Are there suddenly groups in Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Germany and France, and everybody's doing the same thing at the same time? Okay, maybe someone with a bigger, larger interest in the topic is doing this. So we are backbound in that, and we are dependent on the platforms to cooperate in larger investigations.
I'd just add to that. I think Anna described it really well there, but there's also, when we're thinking about domestic issues and when we're thinking about foreign interference or foreign operations, there's two different dynamics at play there. So for example, with something domestic like actors within the state who are trying to undermine vaccines or so on, you know, what's at stake there is whether the public at large believes in vaccines or not. And whether people intended to spread disinformation or whether people are doing it by mistake doesn't really matter, because what we really care about is, you know, is our population safe? Is public health safe? Whereas as soon as you have something that would involve a foreign actor attempting to manipulate your country, well, that in itself, regardless of what outcomes, is a problem. So there's two, you know, it's that intentionality issue. And it's very, very difficult to come close to saying what intentionality is. But with the foreign interference, you know, the fact of it in itself is a problem. Whereas at the domestic level, it's the outcomes that we're more interested in. If people believe crazy things about vaccines, but they have no influence on public health outcomes, well, then maybe we can leave them be.
Yeah, I would say similar. I mean, oftentimes there's a lot of overlap in terms of domestic and foreign in these types of operations. It's hard to draw the distinction. So, for example, here when you have the pro-Russian disinformation narratives coming through on the Bulgarian side, the difference is that when they come to Bulgaria, they adapt to the local specificities. So they'll take elements from the local cultural, historical landscape to frame the same discussion that they could have in Ireland. Like, for example, Eileen said about the fake refugees. The same discussion was had here, just in a very a local contextualized way, right? Or talking about how, you know, various Bulgarian minorities are being persecuted in Ukraine or have been persecuted in Ukraine, the Belisarabians. This is, you know, a way to mobilize a local specific group to be against Zelensky and Zelensky's government and etc. But the general theme could be applied to any of the countries, which is that, you know, Russia is acting defensively, that Ukraine is run by Nazis, whatever it is, right? Whatever the particular narrative is, they tag on some local specificities to make it more appealing to the cultural, historical understandings that the people have in the particular market. But, you know, there's, you know, where does one start and one end? It's hard to say. It's really hard to say.
Interesting, of course, huge overlap that blurs the borders between domestic and foreign, we imagine. So on this front, the next question, which I believe can be interpreted in different ways. Do you feel that the effect of Russian disinformation has diminished after its renewed invasion in Ukraine in 2022? I wonder whether it's diminished in terms of actual number of disinformation or the impact. Let's say we spoke about the attention economy, so maybe there's it is losing momentum. Up to you, experts, to reply.
Well, I might let some of the others take this one. Russian disinformation isn't something that's very apparent here, so it's not something that features in our narratives, and even it's not even discussed very much. Or I think it's because we're right out here on the west of Europe, so the Ukraine war is something that's there, but it's not a huge feature of the disinformation landscape at the moment.
I would say that, yeah, Russian disinformation is still very prevalent here because of the strong Russian sentiment in Bulgaria, pro-Russian sentiment in Bulgaria. It's something that's part of the political discourse internally and has been for a long time to various degrees. But after the invasion of Ukraine, I think the major difference is that it's been incorporated into the existing political divides within this country. So, you know, the power of it is that it arms one side here locally to let's say, even if it's not direct, even if it's not a direct repetition of some disinformation narrative that Putin is putting out, if it's a criticism of NATO, for example, or a criticism of the United States' role in Russia or in Bulgaria, excuse me, or the EU or whatever it is, it's become part of the conversation, and the same tropes that are used by the Russian disinformation campaigns against NATO or the EU are followed, the same general lines. So I think people are more aware that, you know, there is a Russian disinformation campaign, and that this is a, you know, this hybrid warfare style thing is now the new norm. But I'm not sure that has the impact of discrediting it, except for to the choir, right? So the choir already know that it's, you know, we should take it with a pinch of salt. But other than that, I'm not sure that it has diminished it to that it has become part of the local discourse, internal discourse.
Thank you, Hanna.
Yes, thank you. I hope Zoom is keeping me online now. I was logged out a second. Well, maybe I've seen a different development because we had the NATO discussion in Sweden that's been pretty infected. But the big change we saw in the beginning was that many of the disinformation groups that we've been following for many, many years
I'm afraid that there are some technical issues on Anna's side. Okay. And now she's not with us anymore. Hopefully she can fix the issue. I'm sorry to cut this question short. We will give her the floor later. Maybe we can move to the next question and take the occasion to join two questions together, because one of those is what solutions are leading the way to reduce mis and disinformation, and the person before who asked the regulatory question also wanted to follow up by asking whether you believe that states should be pressed to regulate platforms domestically or collaboratively. Anna, I'm sorry, I took the floor. If you wanna maybe join, catch two birds with one stone, and
we're actually under a DDoS attack at my network for just this moment, so that's why the system is going down when it's overloaded. Is it okay if I finish what I was going to say?
Definitely, yes, please.
Thanks. Well, we have had the biggest change in March 2022 was that several of the groups that we've been following and looking at, and the different campaigns in several channels, were actually being pretty quiet. So suddenly the vaccine question was not so big. Suddenly the 5G questions was not so big. Suddenly the windmill project was not so big. Suddenly everybody was talking about something else. So I believe that their focus was changed. But at the same time, when the NATO discussion started in Sweden, the disinformation increased again, and the infection in the discussions were blooming up again. So I believe that there are a lot of disinformation still, but it's changing, evolving, and it's going to change and evolve in the same pace that the technology development is coming, because we already see a lot of disinformation. And as just popped up in my head, I mean, we're just in the beginning. I don't know how much you know about what we call sextortion, when they use artificial intelligence for political people and opinion makers to destroy their credibility. So this is just the beginning. So, but it has changed. Several of the larger groups active before are now very, very quiet.
Thank you. And back to what we were mentioning before, and I believe that this is going to be the final question for the Q&A session today, and maybe I can put together a few. I will repeat them briefly. So someone asked what were the solutions leading the way to reduce mis and disinformation, and then we have a follow-up on the previously regulatory questions about wondering whether states should be pressed to regulate platforms domestically or collaboratively. And last but not least, which I see that our audience is very much aligned, there is a question about whether what would be the impact of the DSA on disinformation regulation. These questions alone should be the object of a webinar, but maybe we can end on a policy note and try to say a few words on this topic. Eileen, yes.
Sure. Well, I think in terms of solutions, I think there isn't any magic bullet solution to reducing disinformation as such. But it's worth noting that everyone is now much more aware of disinformation, and it's on a lot of agendas. So that in itself is a good thing. So when there's talk about re-looking at curriculum, thinking about media literacy, even news media, and hearing journalists talk about media literacy in itself is quite incredible. That is just not something they would have been doing 10 years ago. And they now see that they have a role in educating their own audiences about how news is made and things like that. So in itself, I think there's a lot of great things happening just because people are now aware of disinformation. And the research world, like research on disinformation, was fairly limited. So there's a lot of progress there. When it comes to the bigger question about, whether states should be pressed to regulate platforms, well, yes, we should have regulated them a long, long time ago so that we didn't end up in these disasters in the first place. But now it has to be done collaboratively. You can't deal with these massive global tech giants and have individual countries trying to battle them on their own. That's why we're fortunate in the EU that we can try to do these things collectively. But then within the EU even, so you have the DSA, and there are lots of promising aspects of that. But the platforms have been quite spectacularly good at forestalling things. And speaking from Dublin, Ireland, and Ireland has played a role in enabling them to forestall things. We've seen this with data protection for years, and the concern would be that they will be able to do this with the DSA as well. I don't know if it was this morning or yesterday, there was a meeting in Brussels with lots of academics talking about, will they ever be able to get access to data under the DSA? Like, they've been asking for access to data for how many years now? Lots of agreements, lots of workshops and blah, 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 and nothing has ever happened. So at some point, states have to come together and say, like, you've got to do this.
Hanna?
Thank you. Everything you said, Eileen, super good, because we should have regulated the platforms a long time ago, but there are many things going on, especially in the European Union. So I believe this is something that has to be done together. We have to have a closer discussion with the platforms, and we shouldn't forget that there are several platforms out there. It's not only Twitter and Facebook. So I'm hopeful that everybody is going to be included when it comes to discussions online and how it affects public opinion. I don't think anyone could predict in 2000 2001, 2002, when people started chatting online, just before Facebook was launched, that this is going to be a threat towards democracy. It was just a fun way to communicate. But to be smart, later on, we can say that we should have regulated from the beginning. But there are things actually happening. So I feel hopeful for the future.
It's a good note to end with, Anna. Thank you.
I'm sorry to say that I have a slightly more pessimistic view. But
we
just
should
to
have
offer
switched
some...
the order of speakers.
Yeah. Well, my view is that you know, we can talk about regulation. We can talk about what should have been regulated and what should be regulated, but the lack of practical ability or will to do that is a continuing issue. And the problem that goes a bit deeper than that is the model used by these particular platforms to you know, their actual business model, which was probably kind of not very collaborative or very in sync with the idea of regulation or this type of regulation, at least for disinformation. But my idea about a solution would be something you know, along the lines of citizen journalism, grassroots community journalism, encouraging horizontal collaborative efforts. We have the technology, we can still use this technology, but to a better effect, to analyzing our consumption habits, to doing what we can as individuals, to reaching out to those groups who are most at risk, most vulnerable to disinformation, and not to preach at them, but to help them to develop the skills necessary to be more discerning in terms of the information they consume. And I think, as I said earlier, that this has to be a cornerstone of our education systems across the continent going forward, because this is the new reality. It's not going away. The internet is not going away. It's only going to create more further complications. So we need to adapt, you know, in order to effectively tackle this and to cut the corrosive effect that this is not just having on democratic institutions, but on general societal cohesion, where we cannot seem to reach agreement on any particular issue. It becomes a completely polarized. This is extremely dangerous. And so if we want to do this, I think we have to rethink a lot of the models that we've been using for the last few decades and try to come up with something that's a bit more suitable to the current environment.
Thank you, Keith. All right. We have many more questions, but unfortunately, we are running out of time to answer them. But we really hope that we will be able to continue this conversation. I would like to thank dearly our speakers, FNF for making this project possible, and my dear colleague Leticia for making this webinar possible. We would like to ask you all to reach back to us if you want to participate in writing one of the country fact sheets. We really hope to continue this project and to gather all EU country fact sheets. May I also kindly ask you to rate the webinar using Slido. And I remind you all that in case you want to replay the webinar or spread the word with your contacts, it will be available on YouTube in the next few days. And I also take this occasion to remind you of our next webinar, which is going to be next Monday, conducted by my great colleague Anna Romero, entitled Polluting the Truth About Climate Change, regarding our recent studies on climate change related disinformation, and also of Disinfo 2023, our annual conference on 11 and 12 of October in Krakow. So register and come if you can. This has been a pleasure. So thank you once again, and I wish you all a great afternoon, and I hope to see and hear from you soon. Goodbye.